I mentioned in my last video that I wanted to give the Intel Arc A750 some proper competition, and I think I have just the right GPUs for this. Up first, the GTX1080 Ti, a well-renowned graphics card that has aged wonderfully since its release in 2017. With 11GB of VRAM, the Pascal architecture delivers stellar performance in this top-tier Nvidia GPU. These cards regularly sell for under $200 now, as they have started to become less favorable for mainstream gamers with the release of titles like Alan Wake 2 that require mesh shaders to run properly. And since these 10 series GPUs lack this hardware feature, they've suddenly become much more obtainable and appealing for sim racers looking to build a PC on a budget. Alongside the 1080 Ti, I wanted to bring in something from the 30 series. So here we have the RTX3060, which is still sold new around $300 currently, but can sometimes be found on marketplace sites for closer to $200. This card was often touted as their primary performance level target for the A750. But can this Arc GPU provide comparable or better price to performance value here against either a GTX 1080 Ti or RTX 3060? We'll be testing all three of these cards on my current test platform. For those of you who haven't seen this system in my previous video, I'll list the system specs on the screen now. And we'll be using the just released Intel Arc driver version 31.0.101.5186 and the Nvidia GeForce driver version 551.2. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into the results. So up first we have F123 on the high preset with anisotropic filtering set to 8 times. And the A750 is getting 132 frames per second on average with 1% lows at 104.6 and 0.1% lows at 93.4. So pretty good performance from the A750. If we compare it to the GTX 1080 Ti, we can see it has slightly better average frame rate, but just about the same, with lower 1% lows at 83.9 and 0.1% lows at 52.7, which is a considerable difference between these two. Now, if we bring in the RTX 3060, we'll see that it gets an average frame rate of 168.5, which is slightly above the A750, and better 1% lows at 124.6, but it does have lower 0.1% lows at 64.4, so something to note on that. Now on to Dirt Rally 2. This is on the Ultra preset with 8 times MSAA and 8 times anisotropic filtering. The A750 gets 104.8 frames per second with 1% lows at 80.6. 0% lows at 76.5, so pretty good performance in the A750 here again. Now, compared to the GTX 1080 Ti, it has slightly better average frame rate at 113.7, and similar 1% and 0.1% lows there on the screen as well. So, very comparable performance, I would say, between both of these two, and not really a noticeable difference. Now, if we bring in the RTX 3060, we'll see it actually gets a slightly lower average frame rate at 95.1 and lower 1% and 0.1% lows at 70.5 and 66 even as well. So seems like the newer architecture, but maybe the memory bandwidth might be causing an issue here. Now, on to AMS2. On the high preset with anisotropic filtering set to 8 times, the A750 is getting an even 100 frames per second on average with 1% lows at 64.8 and 0.1% lows at 59. So not the best consistency there as far as frame rate goes, but something to notice compared to the GTX 1080 Ti that it has a much higher average frame rate and higher 1% and 0.1% lows as well. So much stronger showing by the GTX 1080 Ti if you're looking to play Automobilista 2, especially on these higher graphics settings. Now, if we compare that to the RTX 3060, we'll see it also has a higher average frame rate than the A750, along with higher average 1% lows and 0.1% lows as well. So overall, the GeForce architecture for Nvidia is just doing better than what Intel has on this game. Now, on to BeamNG on the high preset. The A750 gets an average frame rate of 97.9 with 1% lows at 63.7 and 0.1% lows at 51.7. Not bad performance, but it's not the best frame consistency in this game. But if we compare it to the GTX 1080 Ti, you can see it has just about the same average frame rate and the same 1% lows, but it does have very low 0.1% lows at 10.2. There were some occasional stutters that were very noticeable, but very occasional that were happening, and not sure what was causing that, if it was something specific in that session, but it was there with the 1080 Ti, and it was actually more noticeable as well with the RTX 3060, which has a slightly higher average frame rate and slightly higher 1% lows, and better 0.1% lows than the 1080 Ti, but still a considerable stuttering happening on that session as well. So not sure if it's the GeForce architecture doing that or just occasional things that were coming up in my sessions there. Now on to ACC. This is on the medium or mid preset. Average frame rate on this for the A750 is a 90.8. 1% lows at 57.4, and 0.1% lows did come down to 20.6. Some occasional stutters did happen here. Not sure what caused that, but it did happen with the A750. The GTX 1080 Ti is getting better performance on the average frame rate at 115.2. and better 1% lows at 84.8. There was also a considerable drop from the 0.1% lows here as well. Not as bad as the A750, but it did happen with the 1080 Ti as well. Now, if we take a look at the RTX 3060, we'll see that the average frame rate is just about the same as the 1080 Ti at 114.2, and 1% lows were just about the same as the 1080 Ti, but it has better 0.1% lows at 72.8, and is considerably better than what the A750 is bringing. But it is important to remember that the RTX 3060 tends to usually skew a little bit higher in cost right now, so something to note on these results. Now, RFactor 2, we're using the Ultra preset at 1080p. The Ultra post-processing as 4K wouldn't load for the Nvidia graphics cards. So the A750 is running at an average frame rate of 71.1 with 1% lows at 56.4 and 0.1% lows at 53.8. The GTX 1080 Ti has a better average frame rate at 105.6, but similar 1% and 0.1% lows there being presented, which shows that overall the consistency of the frame rate is pretty much the same there. Now, if we look at the RTX 3060, we'll see that it has an average frame rate of 84.2, which is lower than what the 1080 Ti was able to do, but still better than the A750. And again, 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty much the same across the board in this game, which goes to show that there's probably some limitations on the game engine, especially could be CPU limiting as well, comparing the average frame rate to the 1% and 0.1% lows. So now on to RaceRoom. This is at 4K with max settings and textures. The A750 is able to get 69 frames per second, 1% lows at 55.8, and 0.1% lows at 48.5. So while it's a consistent frame rate, it's not as high as it could be compared to the GTX 1080 Ti. Its average frame rate's 123.8, and better 1% and 0.1% lows at 78.8 and 67.1. So better performance in this game from the GeForce architecture. Seems like Intel still has some work to do. We can take a look at the RTX 3060 here as well. It's getting a better average frame rate than the A750, but worse than the 1080 Ti at 83.1. It's got consistently it's similar 1% and 0.1% lows, actually slightly lower 0.1% lows compared to the A750 and the GTX 1080 Ti. So could speak to the architecture of that newer but lower end graphics card not working as well compared to the 1080 Ti. So if RaceRoom is a game that you want to play, I would say the GTX 1080 Ti might be the best way to go here, as it provides the best value and performance for the budget. Something else I wanted to bring up is some issues I had trying to update the drivers on the Intel Arc graphics cards. Now, this happened on my test system as well as my workstation that I'm using to edit this video and use as my workstation computer. that also has some trouble updating the graphics drivers. So you can see here it's just spinning with the checking for updates, and then it times out. So not really sure why that's happening, but it happens on all my systems, and I've never really had issues like this before. So I just go and download it directly from the Intel site and just install it from there. Something also to note that I found that was a little bit, it wasn't the best experience, I would say, trying to install this graphics driver compared to the Nvidia or AMD graphics drivers. It just seemed like it had a lot of like graphics cycles. I think it might be due to the firmware updates that are constantly happening. So it makes sense, but it's just something to note. I think the Intel Arc A750 put up a really good fight against the GTX1080Ti and RTX3060. Even though those architectures, both of those cards come with very stable drivers that have been worked on for a very long time, and they've earned the place that they have in the market right now. Intel's put up a really good fight with their first generation graphics card, and I think it's really worth considering, as we can see from the performance here when it comes to sim racing titles. So if you like what you've seen, I would say it's worth looking into them, especially on the used market, as you can usually find really great value compared to going new. Regardless of the choice you make, I think you're going to be really happy with the overall performance that you get from any of these graphics cards, and I would be happy to recommend this to anyone that's wanting to get a great budget sim racing setup in 2024. So let me know down in the comments if you use any of these setups and how you feel about it, if there's any other setups that you think I should be testing, and if you made it this far, I just want to say thanks so much for watching. I hope that you subscribe, and I'm looking forward to making more content like this in the future, and I hope to see you soon.